Hi, I'm Jeff Ranke, Editorial Director of Manufacturing.net and Manufacturing Business Technology. Welcome to Security Breach. On a daily basis, I see a tremendous amount of data and research flow through my inbox, but a recent report from Rackspace Technology definitely caught my attention. According to a recent survey performed by this provider of multi-cloud services and security, two of the top cybersecurity challenges facing companies is a shortage of workers with cybersecurity skills, which was listed by 39% of respondents, and a lack of visibility into the vulnerabilities across all their infrastructure, which was listed by 42% of respondents. While skills gap issues permeate throughout all sectors of the manufacturing landscape, it's simultaneously encouraging and chilling to see that nearly 2 in 5 companies know they need more cybersecurity expertise, but are unable to find it. Similarly, there are some positive takeaways from seeing that enterprises are aware of their lack of knowledge to key vulnerabilities, but concerning that such a higher percentage are dealing with this kind of problem. Both findings help reinforce the dangerous times in which the industrial sector continues to operate. Joining us to discuss this situation is Gary Alterson, Vice President of Security at Rackspace Technology. Gary, thanks for joining us today. Kind of jumping right into things, in the report that you guys put out and some of the research that you did, we talked a lot about some of the more critical vulnerabilities that are popping up within a lot of industries, including the industrial sector. What do you see as some of the most critical ones that are continuing to be exploited sort of over and over again?
Yeah, I think there's two things that I see over and over again in the manufacturing and industrial sector. I think first is just general hygienics of things that are easily controllable, like workstations, servers, work user laptops, things like that. There's a lot of sort of repeated vulnerabilities we see in workstations and servers, and the easiest thing to do, although the thing that organizations have the hardest time doing is just keeping all those patched and upgraded, right? We've gotten better at patching Windows systems, maybe not as great patching Linux systems, and then sort of the applications that sit on top of it, those systems we're not doing a great job of. And you're seeing a lot of vulnerabilities on sort of end users and server workstations that are creating that are creating exposures for manufacturing companies, and they are ones that can be exploited to take down a whole company, cause a ransomware situation, etc. So they're really resilience risks. The second set is a little bit harder to deal with, which is vulnerabilities in operational technology or industrial control systems. A lot of that technology is old. There's vulnerabilities in them, but they're also the hardest to upgrade, hardest to patch, hardest to replace, and they're the hardest often to bring down to do maintenance on, right? Because they're running, it's running manufacturing lines, and they're up a lot of times 24/7.
Yeah. So one of the things that we're sort of looking at some of the root causes, and these are things that we hear all the time. I just kind of like you to react to them. We hear about sometimes it's a culture issue. There's just an unwillingness to change. Sometimes it's an employee training issue. People just don't want to use double authentication or change their passwords. And sometimes it's an investment issue. So when you look at those three potential areas that are really inhibiting the industrial sector from being better when it comes to their cybersecurity, what are some of the things that you've experienced across the board, and maybe what advice could you give to folks in trying to counter some of these most common issues?
Yeah, I think that a large portion of the issue is that investment issue, but the root cause of that is probably the education.
Yeah.
In that executives at manufacturing companies aren't necessarily educated about cyber risks appropriately, and maybe aren't thinking about them as they should in terms of operational and resilience risk versus information. Because I think the concern there, if I'm an executive, is am I making my widgets and I'm making them consistently and getting them sold, right? I can't get them sold if I'm not making them. Um, and instead of talking about information risk, protecting IP, because in some cases, IP isn't the critical piece. In other cases, IP is critical, but there's only so much willing to invest versus investing in keeping a manufacturing line going. Like changing the conversation from information risk to resilience and operational risk is, I think, critical to educating executives right. And I think that will lead to more investment.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that sometimes we come across too is sort of this mantra or this thought process that it's not going to happen to me. We're not Colonial Pipeline, we're not JBS, we're not NVIDIA or any of these other big names that you hear about being hacked. Can you offer some insight there as trying to get past that mindset a little bit of, hey, you're just as susceptible, and a lot of that proprietary and financial data that you have on your network is just as valuable as some of those bigger guys?
Yeah, I think there's two pieces to that. First is, getting the information from the news is probably not the best way to do it, right? Because the news is going to pick out the big sensational targets.
Yeah.
What executives aren't hearing about is all the hundreds of other companies on a daily basis that are maybe hit with ransomware or have a data breach that doesn't make the headlines because they're not huge. So I think education around what in general is happening in the industry specifically. And then second is education about motives, right? Because a lot of it's like, I'm not critical infrastructure, so I don't have to worry. The Chinese aren't going to come after me, or Iranians, or pick your adversary. Bob down the street, whatever it is. But I think education around the fact that there's this industry now behind ransomware, and it's really not about high-profile targets. In fact, preferably, I think ransomware organizations and the organizations that support them probably prefer the lower-profile targets that aren't going to make the news, so they don't become targets of additional investigation or targets of additional scrutiny that a high profile target would be. And what they're looking for is just organizations who are likely to pay, right? And so if you have some money in the bank and they do their research, and you have a need to have your systems running in order to operate your business, then you're a target. And I think that education with actual statistics from industry surveys and things like that, I think would help as well. But yeah, I mean, it's all about education, and it's about reframing from, it's not about the information we have. Now it's about, can we be exploited for financial gain? And the targets are going to be a lot different when that's the case, which it is today, which is why you see healthcare organizations, manufacturing organizations, school districts and things like that being hit with increasing frequency.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point. I think that's where the education starts. If you have data and money in the bank, you're a viable target. That's a great point. You've mentioned ransomware a couple times. That's probably the most prevalent attack, or at least the one that gets the most headlines in the industrial sector. When it comes to ransomware and responding to some of those attacks, where do you stand, Gary, in terms of, do you pay the ransom? Do you try to hold out? When do you get law enforcement involved? What do you see as some of the more effective responses to those types of attacks?
This is the controversial one where there's no right answer.
Yeah.
I'm probably more of a realist than most. Ideally, I would love to see people not paying these organizations, because that's how they go away, right? Is if they remove the profit incentive. However, realistically, I think most organizations are going to pay. Um, if when when the business is on the line, right, or safety systems are impacted, or you've got a manufacturing line that's sitting idle for a week or more, right? I think the answer is that most organizations are going to pay. I think the way you go about doing that, though, is what I would recommend folks think about, rather than just straight paying the ransom. Involve your insurance company. They'll bring in an organization in many cases to help negotiate that ransom. There are experts who that's all they do nowadays is negotiate ransoms and ransomware payments. So there's a smarter way to go about it, and you'll also get a little bit of education and intelligence about the organization you're dealing with. So you'll get the intelligence of, oh, are you likely to get all your data back? Are they likely to come back for more later because they've stolen some information that they're going to keep on the side and potentially release? Are they going to stick to their word? And those organizations that do that for a living, have that intelligence.
Great information about ransomware. Let's talk about some of the good guys here. Can you talk to us a little bit about the work that you and Rackspace are doing in the cybersecurity side of things?
Yeah, we're doing quite a bit of work in cybersecurity. So I lead this security business at Rackspace. We're focused in several different areas. A large focus for us is cloud security, and with that, cloud edge security. So as manufacturers move more information and data to the cloud, or they're starting to use that cloud edge to do some of that IoT processing instead of on-prem, that's where we step in and really provide security solutions for. And those security solutions revolve around things like, data protection, just basic hardening and hygiene, to identity and access management, to detection and response.
Makes sense. In working with different members of the industrial sector, it seems to us that the small and medium-sized businesses are really the ones that need to really energize their cybersecurity programs. When you're working with some of the smaller guys, where's a good place for you to typically start with them, or where should they start in even just developing a cybersecurity plan?
Yeah, I think the smaller companies are in a little bit of a pickle, especially in manufacturing, right? Because we're seeing such a shortage of cybersecurity talent and experienced cybersecurity talent in the market right now, that it's really harder for smaller companies that maybe don't have a ton of resources and financial resources, or their margins may not be able to support a lot of extra hiring, to go and try to attract that top talent. So those are the organizations where we see them coming to Rackspace for help on just, I need a program in general, right? Don't help me evolve my program, just give me a program. And so we've got a set of services from a professional services standpoint to help them build that program from the start. But, where do you start? Like I said, I think you start in two places. One, like I mentioned before, I'm going to give the apple pie answer of yes, you start with policy and process, right? But in reality, from a technical standpoint, you look where your greatest exposure is from a attack surface perspective, which tends to be users and internet presence, and then which increasingly is including more and more data as that data moves to the cloud. And I also think it's really critical for manufacturing firms to bring those OT and operational technology experts to the table and start thinking about how do we protect our manufacturing lines and safety systems. In some cases, I've seen organizations actually do that partially. Like, we've segmented off the the manufacturing system. So manufacturing lines, they're fully protected, but HVAC for those factories and the safety systems for the factories are not segmented off and are on the general IT network, and thus you've got the same kind of exposure. I can still bring down a lot of factories, especially a factory in the south where it's hot, by just taking down the air conditioning.
I think that the last point you made is great. I know we could probably do a whole episode just talking specifically about some of the vulnerabilities of cloud security, but the point you made about it being a different environment, I think that's a really important one. Could you maybe expand on that just a little bit? Because I think there is a general consensus, or at least to the plant manager or anybody else, is, well, that's just basically another data repository. Maybe you could go into a little more detail how that is different and how it has unique security needs.
Yeah. So one of the what I think we see from plant managers and manufacturing companies, and it's not unique to manufacturing, is the assumption that, once I go into that cloud environment, it's another environment, but I don't have to worry about the security. It's all taken care of.
Yeah.
And in reality, there is some security that is taken care of, right? From a physical standpoint, maybe from a networking standpoint, but the access control around your data itself and the configuration of that cloud environment specific to you and your organization, that each customer is still responsible for, or each manufacturer, or whoever's using it is still responsible for. And what we see is the majority of cloud data exposures and breaches occur not from somebody attacking some vulnerability, but from misconfiguration of those environments, i.e., I've left the drive open to the internet, or I've left this storage block open to the internet, or oops, this server or this database, this API, I've misconfigured and allowed it to be open, to the public. Or hey, in many cases, as you're building more and more complex applications, a lot of those applications have complex trust chains built behind them, and a misunderstanding of that trust chain, to where this access over here with this, public-facing website actually changes the access over here because of this complex trust change that then exposes data. So there's some complexity there. The other thing that changes is some of the ways in which we enforce security today on premise, i.e., I'm going to look at the network because I can see everything on the network, and I'm going to look on the server because I can see a lot of things on the server. In the cloud, that starts to go away, right? You don't have full access to the network, and the network is virtual. And you may not have access to the server. You may not have your applications even built on a server. They can be built in something called a container, or they can be built as a series of functions, and there's not even a server behind it at all. And so the way you do security and you get visibility starts to change as well. There's a lot more using APIs to query things and get information. There's a lot more having to build security into the application itself, or that visibility into the application itself, or into the containers themselves, so that you can see what's going on in the same way you would on premise.
Yeah. What's getting scary is for all those configurations that are not obvious, where there's an issue with that configuration, the bad guys are figuring it out sometimes before we are. So we need to stay abreast of all that stuff.
Yeah, or adversaries are going to figure it out because they've got the profit incentives to do so. And it's really difficult for a manufacturing company in particular, who's doesn't exist for the purpose of cybersecurity, to keep abreast in the same way that an adversary, or in some cases adversary is, and even as cybersecurity professionals, the whole reason threat intelligence exists is because somebody's got to do the research of what are the tactics and techniques and procedures that our adversaries are using, so that we can try to keep up.
Yeah, this is a day job for the bad guys, absolutely, to stay on top of all this. So, Gary, anything else you'd like to add before we go?
I'm going to go back to what I said at the beginning. Critical for any manufacturing company is to go back to the basics, basic hygiene, patching, basic hardening of everything in your environment. We've been saying it. I've been in security since 1997. We've been saying it since then, and organizations still aren't doing it. And it's the best thing you can do. And then the second is, make those bridges between your IT and your OT, and start to strategically plan how you're going to protect that OT together, and make sure that you've got that wider, expansive view of OT, and you're taking into account all the ancillary systems as well.
Thanks, Gary. For more information on the work Rackspace does, you can go to rackspace.com. Thanks for joining us today. To catch up on past episodes, you can go to manufacturing.net, IEN.com, or mbtmag.com. You can also check Security Breach out wherever you get your podcasts, including Apple, Amazon, and Overcast. For Gary Alterson, I'm Jeff Ranke, and this is Security Breach.